Hi, I'm Tabby and thanks so much for watching my video. I have this little corner of the internet where I post book videos, which I like to call adult show and tell because it's basically me talking through books that I like and telling you why I think you might like them too. If you live in the UK, then you'll know that even though it's June, we've been having torrential rain. There's nothing we can do about the weather, but what we can do is hunker down with a good book and a cup of tea. And in that vein, I actually have a little tea situation here. How cute is this mug? It has a face on it. I got it in Oaxaca. I think she's so cute and she matches my teapot. That brings me into a really seamless and not at all awkward tangent. Today, I want to talk about some cozy fantasy books. All my videos so far have been more about a specific characteristic that kind of threads through different genres. I haven't really done a video yet talking about a specific genre. If you don't read fantasy books, this video might not be for you. But I also not even wanted to talk about just fantasy books. I want to talk about this subgenre of fantasy books, which is called cozy fantasy. People read fantasy books in general for all different reasons. People who read romantasy books, so romance fantasy books, often enjoy reading fantasy books because it gives the romance higher stakes. I would sacrifice the universe for you. It captures this world-shifting feeling of being in love with actual world-shifting powers. Readers of romantasy might say that it gives them a heightened emotional payoff compared to contemporary fiction about two people falling in love in an office. Some people like to read fantasy looking at completely different societies and different political structures, and it can be really nice to explore what it's like living in different systems without actually reading about actual politics and systems that we have in the world. Because if you're reading a political novel set in our world, you're probably going to be wondering about the author, wondering about their specific bias, wondering if they're pushing an agenda. I guess reading a book set in our world, which is pushing a political ideology, not discouraging that, but you are kind of getting into potential propaganda territory here. Whereas if you just want to explore political philosophy without actually having to fact check and be completely vigilant about what you're consuming, reading a political fantasy can be really interesting. Also, some fantasy books explore invented religions, which is a way to dissect the impact of religion on a society without criticising any existing religion, which obviously would get into more dicey territory. And another obvious reason that people read fantasy books is escapism and for wonder. Cozy fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy which focuses on this escapism and wonder, but without the high stakes. The aim isn't adrenaline or this feeling of what's going to happen next or heightened stakes. The aim is comfort. I've seen it described as a fantasy book that feels like a warm drink in a blanket. Cozy fantasy has a few key features. So first of all, I've already mentioned is low stakes. So there won't really be wars or apocalypses, or if there is going to be a conflict, it will be personal or interpersonal. It's not going to be something that will impact the whole world. There tends to be a more comforting atmosphere, warmth, safety, emotional gentleness, rather than bleak, barren landscape where survival is the only aim. The pacing tends to be more slow-paced, slice of life, so it might focus on somebody who runs a cafe or runs a department store. So we're in another world, but we're focusing on the mundane day-to-day tasks within that world. Building on that, the magic isn't a vessel for conflict and power. The magic is kind of adds to the dreamy like wonder of the surroundings, the fantasy feel. It's typically not a plot device. Cozy fantasy often involves the found family trope where relationships and belonging are the heart of the story, and the setting is typically a cool intimate setting, so like a cafe I mentioned, or a cottage or a little village. Some of the core ideas of cozy fantasy are healing, so the characters are often recovering from burnout or escaping violence, or they're rebuilding their life or finding community. Another element is domesticity. So as I've said, opening a cafe or running a bookshop or learning a craft or homemaking. The other element is emotional safety. If conflict does appear, as I said, it's interpersonal, it's not violent conflict, and it's typically solvable through communication, and it's grounded in empathy. While I was researching what cozy fantasy is and where it kind of slots into the wider fantasy landscape, I learned about a subgenre called hope punk. To explain hope punk, it's first of all useful to briefly touch on grimdark. It just sounds like I'm making up weird words, but basically grimdark fantasy you're probably familiar with. It's a subgenre of kind of speculative fiction which has this bleak tone, and it's typically got these morally grey narrators and violent settings, and it was introduced as a subversion of typical high fantasy with this hero that like kills the dragon and saves everyone, to have a more complicated, morally nuanced book where instead of a noble hero they might be more of a self-serving mercenary, or we have some anti-heroes, and it strips away this idealist lands for a more harsh, cynical reality where there's no guaranteed happy ending, and it's like, how far will this character fall to reach their goals? Because they're in such a bleak environment where it's so difficult to survive, it necessitates and indirectly justifies them doing some pretty bad things. So you can kind of read these like lovable murderers or these gangs of people who are doing heists and stealing things, but you still kind of side with them because good and evil has been completely blurred in this grimdark setting. And I'm not against grimdark. I love a grimdark book as much as the next person. And to be honest, it's interesting that I've chosen to talk about cozy fantasy as my first little fantasy subgenre, because this isn't my favourite type of fantasy. I think cozy fantasy is something that I would turn to in a very specific scenario when I do want that warm hug feeling of safety. Maybe if you're experiencing a loss, or you're recovering from a surgery, or you've just got a lot of difficult things going on in your life and you don't need drama and high stakes from your book because you've got enough of that going on in your personal life. I feel like cozy fantasy is the type of book that I would prescribe you in that situation where you just want to be soothed rather than on the edge of your seat. Hope punk is a subgenre of speculative fiction which is the antithesis of grimdark. It's defined by radical kindness, communal resistance, and a kind of defiant optimism. Because it's positioned explicitly as the opposite of grimdark, it centres on characters who fight for positive change even when the world is bleak. They use kindness, empathy, and cooperation as a form of rebellion. They try to resist systemic injustice through community and solidarity, and they refuse cynicism. The term hope punk was coined in 2017 by an author named Alexandra Rowland, and she described it as a philosophy where kindness and softness doesn't equal weakness, and being compassionate is a political act. Some key elements of hope punk include radical kindness as rebellion, so it's a deliberate, defiant choice to be compassionate. Typically, rather than the lone wolf heroism, which you would often see in grimdark and also epic fantasy, hope punk would prioritise community, found family, alliances, shared purpose. Also a message of hope being an active stance, not naive optimism. Another element that's often found in these hope punk books is small acts of care, shared meals, jokes in dark times. For the past couple of decades, science fiction and fantasy have drifted into this shadowy world of blood and heroes who are morally bankrupt and endings that end up feeling more like a warning than a victory. I appreciate that grimdark has evolved because these epic fantasies where everything's wrapped up too perfectly doesn't feel reflective enough of real life. And also it's just really fun to read about a morally grey narrator who is doing bad things and you're still rooting for. But I also appreciate this subversion of grimdark, kindness, community, and defiance through decency. Hope punk has a focus on people who refuse to become what the world tries to make of them. If the lighting's just dramatically changed, it's because of the lovely, cosy, gloomy weather that we're having to get a light shining into my face, which is so showbiz. Cozy fantasy isn't actually my absolute favourite genre of fantasy books. I typically do prefer something with higher stakes, and I do think that the place it takes up in the fantasy ecosystem is really interesting and really important. I think it's a genre that's quite misunderstood because people read these kind of books, and I've done it myself, expecting the enhanced stakes and drama that is typical of fantasy books and think, what the hell, this is so boring, and something gonna happen. And I feel like understanding that the purpose isn't that loads of things is gonna happen, and that instead it's this warm hug of kind, quiet, calming, soothing wonder. That's the kind of book that you'd want to read in a completely different situation to stay up till 4 AM reading just to see what happens next fantasy book. So I have a little collection of cozy fantasy books to discuss today. First of all, I just wanted to kind of introduce the concept with a book that I feel like a lot of people might be familiar with. And I think this book is a foundational text in whimsical, comforting, cozy fantasy books. I don't have a copy with me because I read it as a child, but I'm talking about The Magic of the Faraway Tree by Enid Brighton. This isn't a recommendation, but I do think it is one of the Hall of Fame cozy fantasy books. This book follows a group of children who climb a magical tree and new lands appear at the top of the tree, each filled with gentle adventures, quirky characters, and a kind of soft, imaginative magic. I didn't spend too long looking for quotes from this book because I'm not really recommending that you read it. It's more to give a flavour of the adult books that I'm going to recommend later. This is from The Enchanted Wood by Enid Brighton. Sometimes the tree shakes and creaks, and it means that a new land is arriving at the top. I do think the community hub that you got from reading The Faraway Tree with all of these familiar, eccentric, quirky characters, even though it predated use of the trope found family, it did have elements of that. Okay, so now onto adult cozy fantasy books, which I actually would recommend. First up is Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. This is set in a tiny cafe in Tokyo where the customers can travel back in time, but only if they return before their coffee cools. So it kind of blends magical realism, fantasy with this emotional healing because it asks the question, what would you do if you could travel back in time once? It's exploring regret, love, connection through small intimate moments rather than grand drama. And it's not cozy because everything that happens is happy, but because it kind of has the safe space, reflective energy. I really enjoyed it, and I feel like it's the kind of book that you want to read again after you finished it to see how it was done. I'm gonna be honest, the first time I read it was before I understood this whole cozy fantasy situation, and I did think this book is pretty slow paced and when is something dramatic going to happen? But now I appreciate that's the point, and I think it's really well done. Here's a quote that I like. Water flows from high places to low places. That is the nature of gravity. Emotions also seem to act according to gravity. When in the presence of someone with whom you have a bond and to whom you have entrusted your feelings, it's hard to lie and get away with it. The truth just wants to come flowing out. This is especially the case when you're trying to hide your sadness or vulnerability. It's much easier to conceal sadness from a stranger or from someone you don't trust. I feel like that's a weirdly scientific encapsulation of that feeling that you have when you've been holding it together around people you don't really know, and then as soon as you see someone that you really love and trust and they just say, "Are you okay?" and you just completely crumble. This book has been quite positively received, but it has had a decent amount of hate on Goodreads for reading too much like a screenplay because it's quite over-explainy. I think that the book actually was written as a play first, which might explain that. This book was translated from Japanese, and I think a lot of Japanese fiction does this thing, which I think is quite beautiful, but maybe if it's your first time reading it, you might find it a bit jarring. But it explains a lot of everyday feelings, which I really enjoyed because I saw a lot of things put on paper and encapsulated in a way that I haven't seen anyone explain. It's just kind of taken as a given. But I think a couple of these Goodreads haters thought that it was kind of overdoing the explanation. This one review just really made me laugh. This book reminds me of an old Italian car, perhaps an Alfa Romeo or a 1970s Ferrari. On the surface it looks great, but when you start it up, oh dear. At best, the poor thing limps along well under the speed limit, an ominous cacophony of clunking sounds and grinding noises issuing from under the hood. There are complaints about the narrative motor. I really respect this person's commitment to the car metaphor, and I actually think this hater would write a really good book. The criticism about the narrative motor, I think, is quite typical of cozy fantasy books, because as I was saying, it's not this, what's going to happen next? Oh my goodness, I need to keep reading, and it's more this kind of peaceful, contemplative. The next book though, I do think has a bit higher stakes and a bit more of what's going to happen next, and I do remember feeling quite emotionally invested in what was going to happen to the characters. And this is The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. This book follows a caseworker called Linus Baker, who is sent to evaluate a group of magical children living on a remote island. Linus Baker leads a quiet life. At 40, he has a tiny house with a devious cat and his beloved records for company. And at the department in charge of magical youth, he spent many dull years monitoring their orphanages. One day, Linus is summoned by extremely upper management and given a highly classified assignment. He must travel to an orphanage where 6 dangerous children reside, including the Antichrist. There, Linus must somehow determine if they could bring on the end of days, but their guardian, charming and enigmatic Arthur Parnassus, will do anything to protect his wards. As Arthur and Linus grow ever closer, Linus must choose between his duty and his dreams. Oh my god, I wonder whether he's going to pick his duty or his dreams. It's so tough to say. It's always like a 50-50 split in books, whether they're going to go with their duty or their dreams. I just don't know. This book really leans into the domestic, mundane element that cozy fantasy books lean into, which sounds boring, but it's actually quite funny. So he's basically a civil servant in an alternate version of reality where there are these magical children. Even though Linus is evaluating all these children with magical powers, he's doing it through this bureaucratic, administrative lens, and he's worrying about the paperwork. He has quite a small, particular world where he likes what he likes, and he stays in his house with his cat, and he doesn't really have these big dreams. He does his job for the department in charge of magical youth, and he doesn't really expect anything amazing to happen, and he sees this trip to be sent to this dangerous island as a massive inconvenience and quite terrifying. It's such a sweet, heartwarming, lovely book, and it made me laugh. It is very, very cozy fantasy. Just spilt my tea. Here's a quote. "Change often starts with the smallest of whispers, like-minded people building it up to a roar." That is so hopecore. That is so no lone wolf hero. Let's all do our bit together, and that's how change happens. It's not this one person who's the most powerful person in the land who arbitrarily can decide whether to save the world or not. It's everyone waking up every day and doing their best to make a little decision which will make the world a little bit better. I'm getting to fridge magnet inspirational quote territory. Here's another quote I like. "A home isn't always the house we live in. It's also the people we choose to surround ourselves with. You may not live on the island, but you can't tell me it's not your home. Your bubble, Mr. Baker. It's been popped. Why would you allow it to grow around you again?" I really like this book, and I think you will too. The next book I don't have with me. I've got no idea where it is, and it's really annoying because I think it's the most beautiful book cover ever. So I'll put it on screen. This is The Dallergut Dream Department Store by Miye. This is a whimsical Korean fantasy book which imagines a magical department store where dreams are crafted, packaged and sold. So it follows a new employee as she's learning the rhythms of the dream world. This epitomizes slice of life magic. So the magic is the background ambiance. So the character's main focus is getting a job in this department store and deciding which department she wants to work in. It's a workplace fantasy, and it's kind of about the quiet delight of discovering how an enchanted world functions behind the scenes. When a person or an animal falls asleep, their soul has the option to go to a store and choose a dream. So they show up in their pajamas and the workers of the store know their dream preferences and help them decide what kind of dream to buy. Payment is rendered after you wake up through the emotions that you experience from the dream. As is typical of cozy fantasy, this is more about the emotional experience of reading the book than the plot. Not loads happens, but the vibes are very dreamy, wondrous, cozy. Next up we have A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers, and this book is set in a future where robots gained consciousness, and then after they gained consciousness they set down their tools and they went off to live in the wild. I really enjoyed the musings it has in it about purpose, nature and productivity. So the book follows a tea monk named Sibling Dex who wants to get out of the city, and Sibling Dex meets a curious robot and they go on this journey through some peaceful nature landscapes. This is cozy fantasy but also hopecore because it feels very contemplative and it's about rest and what it means to care for yourself and others, and I also think it has very strong anti-AI messaging. Sometimes a person reaches a point in their life where it becomes absolutely essential to get the fuck out of the city. It doesn't matter if you've spent your entire adult life in a city, as was the case for Sibling Dex. It doesn't matter that your friends are there, as well as every building you love, every park whose best hidden corners you know, every street your feet instinctively follow without needing to check for directions. The city was beautiful, it really was. A towering architectural celebration of curves and polish and coloured light laced with the connective threads of elevated rail lines and smooth footpaths, flocked with leaves that spilled lushly from every balcony and centre divider, each inhaled breath perfumed with cooking spice, fresh nectar, laundry drying in the pristine air. The city was a healthy place, a thriving place, a never-ending harmony of making, doing, growing, trying, laughing, running, living. Sibling Dex was so tired of it. The urge to leave began with the idea of a cricket song. The intense feeling of containment within the city became intolerable. Dex wanted to inhabit a place that spread not up, but out. Dex is experiencing burnout and overwhelm and claustrophobia from the city and leaves to go and be in nature and have some different experiences. Dex then meets a robot. I don't think people be meeting robots. I feel like the robots ran away to hide because they gained consciousness and were like, we're not going to be your tools anymore, please leave us alone. So when Dex meets the robot, Dex is thinking, what the hell are you? And the robot's also a bit like, what the hell are you? Here's another quote. So Dex says to the robot, "It doesn't bother you, the thought that your life might mean nothing in the end. That's true for all life I've observed. Why would it bother me?" Mosscap's eyes glowed brightly. "Do you not find consciousness alone to be the most exhilarating thing? You and I, we're just atoms that arranged ourselves the right way and we can understand that about ourselves. Is that not amazing?" The book is basically saying that in order for a person to have purpose, they don't need to do some huge, amazingly productive thing with their life. The last book I wanted to feature in this video is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, and this one's kind of on the brink of cozy fantasy because I think it's a little bit eerie. It's not the most cozy feeling book. You do feel a little bit uneasy what's going on here, but I just think it's so gentle and it feels very sacred, and the narrator is so curious and full of wonder, and it is definitely a unique kind of escapism, so I thought I'd include it in this video. It's not cozy in the kind of tea shop, dream department store sense, but it's cozy in a quiet, contemplative sense. This one's a bit more literary than some of the others on my list. It has a kind of meditative feel to it. Piranesi lives in the house, perhaps he always has. Then messages begin to appear, scratched out in chalk on the pavements. There is someone new in the house, but who are they and what do they want? I've never met a narrator as pure and consistently optimistic as Piranesi. He's weirdly charming and he lives in this house, and the house seems to be his whole world. It's extremely difficult to describe because it's so weird and so richly built, but I'll give you an example. When the moon rose in the 3rd northern hall, I went to the 9th vestibule. Entry for the 1st day of the 5th month in the year that Albatross came to the southwestern halls. I climbed up the western wall until I reached the statue of a woman carrying a beehive. Basically, he lives in this house. The house has wings and staircases and different floors, and the house just seems to keep going infinitely. It's really weird and really original as a setting. Piranesi himself is kind of going about his day making scientific observations. He's very non-judgmental. If he does form a judgment, he always gives his subject the benefit of the doubt. It's really gentle and really thought-provoking and one of a kind. Those are all the cozy fantasy books that I wanted to discuss. I hope that you like this video, and even if you're not going to be sprinting to the bookshop to buy cozy fantasy books, hopefully if you do experience the time in your life when you just want this pure low-stakes escapism, you now know where to turn. And if you do happen to read one, hopefully you'll know more what to expect and why it's not the most high stakes situation. If you have any cozy fantasy or hopecore book recommendations, then please let me know in the comments. Also, if there are any types of books that you want me to talk about, as always, I'm all ears. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the week and enjoy hunkering down in this weather.